Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, hope you guys are all doing well. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that not too long ago, I made a video where I did a character profile of one of the most memorable and iconic movie villains of all time. Initially the video was going to be a one-off, because character evaluation and psychology really isn't my forte. However, I really enjoyed making that video and it made me ponder whether or not I should begin a whole new series on the channel. One of the things that I've recently rediscovered an interest in is fiction. These days I'm not much of a reader, unless you count the Holy Bible, which I've been reading bit by bit, and I'm trying to set aside more time for. But in regards to actual fiction written purely for the sake of entertainment and escapism, it's not something I do much now. However, in the past I was a bit of an avid reader, and some of my favourite novels are The Lord of the Rings, which I consider to be some of the best fantasy books ever written. I could easily do a detailed character analysis of just about every major character in Tolkien's works, and it would probably make for some interesting and thought-provoking content. The issue is that it might be a little bit too easy in a way. What I mean by that is, when it comes to the Lord of the Rings series, they've really been done to death on the internet. Each character has been practically deconstructed and covered so much more articulately than I could. And for me to make these kinds of videos, they really have to have something to offer me. And I would like to at very least speak about a character who maybe hasn't been covered as much as others, but one that I think I can add my own unique perspective on. When it comes to the Harry Potter series, my history with that series is pretty standard. As a kid I enjoyed the books and the movies, and as long-time subscribers of mine will know, I absolutely love the video games. Seriously, the Harry Potter video games. The older ones anyway, are massively underrated, but I digress. As far as the novels go, like I said, I enjoyed them, but if truth be told, they really are nothing special. There's a lot of things about them that really don't make sense, and a lot of the writing is in some ways pretty amateurish. However, one thing that fascinates me about the Harry Potter novels, and one of the reasons why I've chosen to make an analysis video about it, is because it's a fascinating series in regards to psychology. And there is often a lot of ambiguity surrounding several of the characters. I could probably make a whole series of videos breaking down major characters from the series, and a lot of it would probably be me filling in the blanks and providing my own interpretations of them. It's true that a lot of them have a lack of development, and a lot of the backstories and ideologies are really open to interpretation, which explains why Harry Potter has so much fan fiction even when compared to other works of fiction. One character who I've decided to do a character profile for is a character who I personally find to be one of the most interesting and controversial characters in the entire series. He's a character who in the early part of the series, in fact more than half of it, developed into this legendary, somewhat mythical figure in the wizarding world. It says a lot about the character when, despite the fact that he is dead long before the beginning of the story itself, he's able to become so interesting to talk about and examine. The character I'm of course referring to is James Potter. So James Potter is of course Harry's father, and in the early part of the series, his backstory, history and family lineage is pretty much kept deliberately ambiguous. We hear about the character from what I would describe as unreliable narrators. One of the most important things to take into consideration when analysing characters, lore, ideologies and plot points from the Harry Potter series and the Wizarding world is the fact that the way that the books are structured, everything is revealed to us, the reader, through the perspective of Harry Potter himself. Harry in many ways could be considered a plot device, since he's practically designed to represent the innocence and naivety of the reader. This means that while Harry is introduced to the Wizarding world, and the characters, lore, backstory and history of that world is taught to him, we of course experience this alongside him, and everything that he learns is taken purely at face value. Harry has no experience of this world, he knows nothing about its culture and history, and he basically believes everything he's told. He is a child after all. This not only makes many of the characters unreliable narrators, but Harry himself is an unreliable narrator, and as the protagonist of the series, with everything told to us from his perspective, we as the reader tend to adopt Harry's opinions, values and prejudices, and if truth be told, even his biases towards certain characters and ideas. This is particularly important in regards to the book's depiction and interpretation of the character of James Potter. We hear about James exclusively from the people who knew him and had a positive affinity for him, rather than see for ourselves the kind of character he actually was. So sometime before the beginning of the story, where Harry is given to his aunt and uncle by Dumbledore, James Potter is murdered by the main villain of the series, Voldemort. It's important for me to point this out first, because in my personal opinion, James Potter's death, and more importantly the way he died, significantly coloured the way he was remembered by the wizarding world, more so than his actions during his life before that night and what led up to it. In a way, you could say that James died a hero's death, went out in a blaze of glory, so to speak. I mean, what more honourable death is there than sacrificing yourself to save your family, protecting your wife and son from an evil wizard who came to murder them, fearlessly facing him, knowing you have no chance of survival. This act of course gave Lily enough time to do what she needed to do to make sure Harry was safe. Such a heroic act of pure love from a father who genuinely loved his family is what James Potter became famous for. In many ways he became a martyr and a legend. So in the first 4 books of the Harry Potter series, Harry hears a lot of second-hand information about his father and the kind of man he was, every bit of it positive. Harry, as well as you the reader, get an idealistic view of the character. You hear about all his positive traits, how he was so tremendously talented, he was a great Quidditch player, a great duelist, and an almost legendary strategist. He was also tremendously charismatic, charming, and good-looking. You hear how he was such a great friend, great student, perfect father that Harry never knew. He's practically perfect in every way. He's basically the Giga Chad of the Harry Potter universe. He's a badass, the badass of all badasses. Women want him, men want to be him. Everybody loved him, except those who are just jealous that they could never be as amazing and perfect as him. He's practically perfect in every way. Here's the problem. He's almost too perfect, isn't he? This is where it becomes interesting. See, part of Harry's character development is as he grows older and wiser, he's able to find ways to cope with and overcome some of his issues and insecurities. You see, Harry is a character who is young, naive, and not particularly well adjusted. One thing that isn't really conveyed well in the movies, but is heavily implied throughout the series of books, is that Harry has severe abandonment issues, daddy issues in particular. This is to be expected since he grew up without his parents, and had to deal with a horrific upbringing and abuse at the hands of his uncle, who treated him like absolute dirt his whole childhood. What this does is it leaves Harry particularly susceptible to emotional abuse at the hands of his potential male role models throughout the series. Throughout the series, Harry pretty much clings on to any potential father figure he finds, regardless of whether or not this is in his best interest. The obvious example of this is Dumbledore, who in retrospect is directly responsible for a lot of Harry's childhood trauma and abuse. It was Dumbledore who sent Harry to the Dursleys. It was Dumbledore who, behind the scenes, orchestrated many trials and tribulations for Harry to overcome, in an attempt to finally sacrifice him. I'm not going to talk too much about Dumbledore in this video, because other channels have basically done him to death, and at this point, he's a character who's basically been unravelled. The reason I bring him up is because a lot of the decisions he makes throughout the series either don't make any sense, or show more moral ambiguity than was first thought about the character. And he probably stands as the most prolific and consistent example of what I'm talking about when I refer to Harry's severe daddy issues and naivety. Other examples of this are of course Remus Lupin and Sirius Black. Harry's relationship with both of them is strange, and that could be a video of its own. We'll talk about it later. Back to James. Harry never knew him, so all his life he fantasized and imagined what it would be like to know his parents, and what his life and upbringing would be like if they were still alive. In his childhood naivety, he has this perfect depiction of his father in his mind, confirmed by every single one of his adult mentors basically blowing smoke up James's arse, and making Harry think he was this unambiguously good man. However, as the series progresses, as Harry begins to grow and mature, and as more about James's backstory is revealed, you start to realise that this idealistically imagined interpretation of James may not be entirely true. I mentioned earlier in the video that many of the characters in Harry Potter are unreliable narrators, and that James's heroic death at the hands of Voldemort left an impression of him that never really went away. This actually does happen in real life, and it's something that I think the writer J.K. Rowling, or whoever it was who wrote Harry Potter, doesn't get as much credit as they may deserve. Usually when a person dies, the friends and family of that person tend to overlook their flaws, remembering and sometimes even embellishing the good things about them and their more positive traits. The truth about James Potter, and what's generally implied about the character later in the series, is that he really wasn't a good person. In fact, if truth be told, he was a bit of an asshole. So let's examine what we know based on what's either explicitly revealed or implied about the character. On a side note, this is left completely unexplored in the movie, with only one scene referencing it that never gets brought up again. However, in the books, as what usually turns out to be the case, there is so much more detail. Contrary to what we thought about James Potter, he was an incredibly flawed and morally ambiguous character. From my perspective, based on what's implied about the character, he represents a very particular type of person in real life. He's basically a manipulative, spiteful, narcissistic, upper middle class douchebag who had a seriously negative influence on the people around him and treated the people of a lower social status than him like absolute dirt. He was a bully who was particularly nasty to Severus Snape, who himself is a pretty morally ambiguous character, who I might actually make a separate video about one day, because I think just like James, he's a character who is misunderstood by the fandom in a lot of ways. He's actually similar to James in some ways, despite being the opposite of him in others, but I digress. James Potter represents the absolute lack of humility, empathy and honour shown by many people with a high social status and an upper middle class background. I'm not actually sure if this next part was entirely intended to come across this way by Rowling, and this could just be a result of me filling in the blanks, but I truly believe that James Potter is a narcissist, a manipulator and a bit of a scumbag, but one who, based on his social status and superficial traits such as athleticism, talent, intelligence and charisma, as well as good looks, which does play a part in how people ultimately perceive you, may have led to his negative and downright scummy traits being ignored by his peers. Again, I could be filling in the blanks here, but for some reason I think Rowling heavily implied this throughout the series, with James in the early part of the series being depicted as this unrealistically perfect character, with no character flaws to speak of. This couldn't have been an accident, and I think it's safe to assume that given what we know about James in retrospect, he was not a good person. That's not to say that he was necessarily a villain, but he was at very least, just like Snape, a morally grey and ambiguous character. While we only get a glimpse and a brief description of his horrendous treatment of Snape, given the nature of bullies and narcissists in general, I strongly doubt that Snape was his only victim. It's just that we happen to find out the truth about James's character from Snape. I believe part of the reason James targeted Snape was simply that Snape happened to be an easy target. Snape, unlike James, was of a relatively low social status, while James came from a wealthy and noble pureblood wizarding family with a tremendous amount of influence and prominence. Snape was a half-blood who came from a relatively poor family. Snape came from the Prince family, who were a dying line that he happened to be the last of. And Snape, in addition to his relatively low social status, was generally an outcast. He wasn't particularly good-looking, talented or charismatic, and he wasn't particularly sociable. He was the stereotypical edgelord who had his own agency, did his own thing, and didn't care what other people thought of him. His affinity for potions, for example, kept him indoors, studying like a stereotypical nerd who doesn't take part in sports, social events or popular trends. He kept to himself and felt somewhat rejected by his peers. James and his friends took advantage of this and treated Snape terribly for years. This led to Snape confiding in some of the more upper-class, aristocratic wizards, such as the Malfoy family, who were more accepting of him than his peers and the people of his own social status were, leading Snape down a dark path that had some pretty major consequences for both sides. Speaking of James's friends, Two of his closest friends, Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew, followed him around most of the time. It's very clear that James was the alpha of his group, and where he went, the others followed. Sirius and Pettigrew were also complicit in the bullying of Snape and potentially other students throughout their years at Hogwarts, basically following in James's footsteps. You might have noticed that I left Remus Lupin out, because I believe it's stated in the book that Remus never actually involved himself in the bullying, and wanted no part of it. Despite being one of James's friends, you get the sense he was more of a friend out of convenience. Sirius and Pettigrew, on the other hand, for them it went beyond friendship. They were sycophantically obsessed with James, Sirius in particular, and they basically did everything he did, and followed his every lead. This is very common with upper middle class jocks and their social circles. In fact, speaking of Sirius and Pettigrew, it goes beyond a mere implication. Sirius is basically a lapdog. I mean, he literally turns into a dog. Dogs, of course, are known for their loyalty to their masters, never leaving their master's side and following them till the very end. Pettigrew, despite being a James fanboy and showing some of the same sycophantic traits, he never had the same sense of loyalty. He turns into a rat, and what are rats known for? They're known for jumping ship. In the final days of James Potter's life, the James Potter ship was sinking, and Pettigrew jumped sides in an instant. Rat is also a term used to describe a grass, and of course Peter does exactly that, grassing James. The reason I bring this up is because the sycophantic obsession with James that Sirius has is ultimately what leads to a short yet toxic relationship that develops between Sirius and Harry. When Sirius breaks out of prison and finds Harry, revealing that he never betrayed James and was framed, Harry immediately develops a bond with him. I mentioned earlier in the video that Harry has daddy issues, willing to latch onto any potential father figure who crosses his path. This is particularly important with Sirius. Sirius is Harry's godfather. He was also very close to Harry's actual father, making it so that in Harry's mind Sirius is the perfect surrogate father for him, despite the fact Harry barely knows him and doesn't have an idea what he's like. He latches onto him anyway. Now in the movies, this is depicted as a very wholesome and positive thing. Sirius is depicted as a kind, loving and empathetic surrogate father for Harry, and one who will never leave his side. The problem is that this isn't really the case, and it's actually something that goes over a lot of people's heads. You see, the movies had this all wrong. Movie Sirius is completely different to book Sirius, in terms of his overall attitude and personality, as well as his behaviour towards Harry. Let's not forget that during Harry's entire childhood prior to meeting Sirius, Sirius never cared about him. He never made an attempt to escape prison and contact him. He never showed any interest in him. And during that time he seemed content with being a prisoner, and mourning the loss of his best friend James. You see, what set in motion Sirius's escape from prison, and his desire to enter Hogwarts, had nothing whatsoever to do with Harry. It was entirely motivated by revenge. He discovered while in prison that Pettigrew had survived, and with a desire to avenge James, he decided to break out and hunt him down. Meeting Harry in the process was merely a coincidence, and him offering to allow Harry to live with him seems to have been done impulsively, and out of a somewhat misguided idea of an obligation he may or may not have had as Harry's godfather. But I think it's implied in the books that the real reason for this is a bit more disturbing and sad. You see, I mentioned before Sirius was obsessed with James. He was sycophantically in love with James, to the point where he was practically his pet. He was so sycophantically obsessed with him that he really couldn't function without him, and the very fact that Harry reminded him of James led to Sirius getting to know him. Again, in the movies this is depicted as Sirius genuinely caring about Harry and wanting to be a good mentor and father figure to him. In the book, however, Sirius is actually quite neglectful to Harry, so much so that in the 5th book, when Harry finds out what a scumbag his father really was, and starts to question everything he's been taught growing up, he tries to confide in Sirius, and Sirius basically ignores him, basically doing the same thing Dumbledore does, and keeping Harry in the dark. Despite this, when Sirius dies, Harry has a mental breakdown. Harry barely knows Sirius at all, and Sirius never did a single thing for him, but despite this, Harry mourns his death, as if he is losing his father all over again. The truth is that James was not a good person, neither was Sirius. As morally questionable as Snape was, He was the only character Harry ever met who was honest with him about James. Harry knows this and is utterly devastated by it, which serves as a major part of Harry's character development and proves for him to be a necessary part of growing up. One thing that did come to my mind while I was devising this video is that Snape's hatred for James, and by extension his hatred for Harry, is something that is quite fascinating in retrospect. Aside from the obvious motive that James treated Snape like dirt for years and even took the girl he loved, marrying her and having a child with her, another possible reason for Snape's hatred could be to do with the way that people often reacted to James's actions. It's stated in the book that James once rescued Snape, saving his life, and was praised as a hero for it. Snape explains that it was in fact James who caused the incident in the first place that almost got him killed, meaning that rather than be celebrated and praised for it, he really should have been punished for it. By extension, Harry breaks many school rules during his time at Hogwarts, and for the most part doesn't really face the consequences. This is reminiscent of what I was talking about earlier in regards to how James is perceived by others. Due to his talent, charisma and social status, James was often rewarded for things that he really shouldn't have been, and was often given the benefit of the doubt, whereas other people such as Snape would likely not have been. Without the social status and the talent, you won't be given the same courtesy. Just something to think about. All in all, I think it's pretty clear that James Potter was a great man for his talents, skills, and the impact he had on the wizarding world in general, but as a person he was morally questionable, and potentially a bit of a narcissist. Either way, he's a rather fascinating character to analyse and talk about. He was a likeable asshole who, despite his flaws, died as a hero. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed making this video. Let me know if you want to see more content like this in the future. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching and God bless.